There are places in this world where the sun itself seems afraid to cast its light. I learned this truth in the winter of 1847, in a forgotten corner of New Mexico territory, where the desert meets the mountains and the old Spanish missions stand like broken teeth against an indifferent sky. My name is Father Miguel Sebastián de Torres, and I have been appointed by the church to minister to the souls of San Cristóbal de las Sombras, a settlement so remote that even God seems to have trouble finding it. What I witnessed there, what happened to the children, has convinced me that there are forces in this world that predate our understanding of good and evil, forces that wait in the spaces between light and dark, hungry for something we cannot comprehend. The journey to San Cristóbal took 11 days through terrain that grew increasingly hostile with each passing mile. The Mexican-American War had ended just months before, and the land still bore the scars of that conflict. Though this part of the territory had seen little actual fighting, the violence here was older, more patient. My predecessor, Father Ignacio, had died under circumstances the bishop refused to elaborate upon, saying only that the position needed to be filled immediately and that I should prepare myself for hardships both material and spiritual. I was young then, 28 years old, filled with the certainty that faith could overcome any darkness. The desert taught me otherwise. San Cristóbal sat in a valley carved by a river that ran dry for most of the year, leaving behind a bed of white stones that clicked and whispered when the wind moved through them. The settlement consisted of perhaps 40 families, most of them descendants of Spanish colonists who had intermarried with the local pueblos. Their ancestors had built the mission church 200 years earlier, using adobe bricks mixed with the blood of sacrificed animals, or so the stories went. The church stood at the center of the village, its walls thick and windowless except for narrow slits that let in thin blades of sunlight during the day. The bell tower leaned slightly to the east, as if listening for something beyond the mountains. I arrived on a Tuesday in late November, just as the first snows were beginning to dust the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range. The village had a quality of stillness that I found unsettling, not the peaceful quiet of contemplation, but something more like held breath, like the moment before a scream. The people who came to greet me moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes constantly scanning the ground around them as if checking for something they expected but dreaded to find. I noticed it immediately but said nothing, attributing their behavior to the isolation and harshness of frontier life. The village alcalde, a weathered man named Don Rodrigo Vargas, welcomed me with formal courtesy but little warmth. He was perhaps 60 years old, his face carved into deep lines by sun and wind, his hands scarred from a lifetime of labor. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but brief, and I noticed he stood with his back to the afternoon sun, his shadow stretching long and dark behind him. He seemed relieved by this, though I did not understand why. Don Rodrigo showed me to the priest's house, a small adobe structure adjacent to the church, its walls cool even in the afternoon heat. The interior was sparse, furnished with a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, and a wooden chest. A crucifix hung on the eastern wall, and beneath it someone had placed a bowl of salt and a bundle of dried sage. I asked about this, and Don Rodrigo's face became carefully neutral. "Father Ignacio's things," he said. "We thought perhaps you might want them." "What happened to Father Ignacio?" I asked. Don Rodrigo was silent for a long moment, looking past me toward the narrow window that faced the church. "He left," he said finally. "One morning he was here, and the next he was not. We found his cassock and his rosary on the altar, but the man himself had vanished. Some say he walked into the desert, others say he went back to Mexico City. No one knows for certain." I unpacked my few belongings while Don Rodrigo waited, his presence making the small room feel even smaller. When I had finished, he cleared his throat and said, "There are certain customs here, Father, old traditions. Some are from the church, and some are from before the church. It would be wise to respect both. I am here to serve God and His church," I said. "Other traditions are of no concern to me." Don Rodrigo's expression flickered with something that might have been pity or fear. "Of course, Father. I only meant to say that the people here, they have their ways that have kept them safe." "Safe from what?" He did not answer, only gestured toward the church. "The evening mass will begin in an hour. The people will want to meet you properly." Then he left, moving quickly for a man his age, his shadow trailing behind him like a reluctant companion. That first evening mass was sparsely attended. Perhaps 20 people came, mostly older women and a handful of men who stood at the back of the church with their hats in their hands. I noticed immediately that there were no children, which struck me as odd. Every Catholic settlement I had ever visited had been full of children, their noise and energy a natural part of the community. But San Cristóbal was silent in a way that felt deliberate, purposeful, as if the absence of children was not an accident, but a choice. I conducted the Mass according to the standard rites, my voice echoing strangely in the thick-walled church. The congregation responded when appropriate, but their voices were subdued, barely rising above whispers. I found myself watching them as I spoke the familiar words, noting the way they glanced frequently toward the narrow windows, the way they positioned themselves so that their shadows fell away from the altar rather than toward it. These small behaviors accumulated in my mind like drops of water filling a cup, and by the time I gave the final blessing, I was deeply uneasy without being able to articulate why. After the Mass, a few of the women approached me with gifts, small things wrapped in cloth, bread and dried fruit and a jar of honey. They spoke in low voices, their Spanish accented with Tewa words I did not know, thanking me for coming, welcoming me to San Cristóbal. One of them, an elderly woman named Doña Maria, touched my hand and said, "You must be careful, Father. The light here is not like the light in other places. It shows things that should remain hidden." I did not understand her meaning, but before I could ask, she had withdrawn, moving back into the cluster of women who waited by the door. They left together, walking close to one another, their voices rising in a soft murmur that might have been prayer, or might have been something older. I spent my first night in San Cristóbal, reading from Father Ignacio's breviary, which I had found in the wooden chest, along with several journals written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic toward the end. Most of the entries were routine observations about the settlement, the weather, the small dramas of village life. But the final entries, dated in the weeks before his disappearance, spoke of dreams that troubled him, of voices he heard in the empty church, of a growing conviction that something was wrong with the light in San Cristóbal, that it fell in ways that defied natural law. In his last entry, dated 3 days before he vanished, Father Ignacio wrote, "The children have begun to sing in the night. Their voices come from the arroyo, from the place where the old kiva stands buried beneath the sand. I have asked the parents about this, but they will not speak of it. They look at me with eyes that hold both pity and terror, as if I am already lost. I have decided to investigate the arroyo myself. If I do not return, let whoever reads this know that I went seeking truth and found something that truth cannot contain. May God forgive me. May God protect the children." I closed the journal, my hands shaking slightly. The room had grown cold despite the warm evening, and I found myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But there was nothing, only the darkness of the desert night, and somewhere in that darkness, the dry riverbed where something waited that Father Ignacio had feared to name. The next morning, I woke to the sound of church bells ringing in a pattern I did not recognize. It was not the call to Mass, but something more urgent, more frantic. I dressed quickly and hurried outside to find the village in a state of controlled chaos. People were moving through the streets carrying bundles, driving livestock into pens, boarding up windows. The sky was clear and blue, showing no sign of storm or danger, but the villagers moved as if catastrophe was imminent. I found Don Rodrigo near the church, directing several men as they reinforced the heavy wooden doors with additional crossbeams. "What is happening?" I demanded. "Why are the bells ringing?" Don Rodrigo turned to me, his face gray with exhaustion and something deeper, something like despair. "The children are missing, Father. 5 of them. They did not come home last night. Missing? Where did they go?" "To the arroyo," he said quietly. "Where the old ones lived. Where they should not have gone." I felt a chill despite the morning warmth. "We must organize a search party immediately. If children are lost in the desert, every moment matters." Don Rodrigo shook his head slowly. "We know where they are, Father. That is not the problem. The problem is what will return." Before I could respond, a cry went up from the eastern edge of the village. People began running in that direction, and I followed, my cassock catching on the dry brush that grew between the adobe houses. A crowd had gathered at the top of a small rise that overlooked the arroyo, a wide channel cut deep into the earth by centuries of seasonal floods. The arroyo was empty now, its bottom covered with smooth stones and patches of scrub grass. And there, walking up the slope toward the village, were 5 children. They moved in single file, their steps perfectly synchronized, their faces blank and serene. They were dressed in the clothes they had worn when they disappeared, simple cotton shifts and trousers that were clean despite a night spent in the desert. As they drew closer, I could see that they were unharmed, showing no signs of distress or exhaustion. They walked steadily, their eyes fixed straight ahead, not acknowledging the crowd of people who had gathered to watch them. The parents pushed forward, crying out the names of their children, reaching toward them with desperate hands. But Don Rodrigo grabbed the first father who tried to approach, holding him back with surprising strength. "Wait," he hissed. "Look at them carefully. Look before you touch them." I did not understand his warning until the children came close enough for me to see them clearly in the morning light. They appeared perfectly normal, healthy and whole, their small faces calm and expressionless. But as they walked past me, I realized what Don Rodrigo meant, realized what was missing, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The children cast no shadows. The morning sun was bright and direct, falling at an angle that should have created clear, defined shadows on the ground. Every stone, every blade of grass, every person in the crowd had a shadow stretching away from the light. But the children walked through the world as if they were not quite solid, as if they were images projected onto the air rather than flesh and blood. Where their feet should have created darkness, there was only the unchanged ground, showing through them as if they were made of glass. A woman screamed, a sound of such pure horror that it seemed to tear the fabric of the morning itself. She was the mother of one of the children, a girl of perhaps 7 years old with dark hair braided down her back. The woman lunged forward, breaking free from the hands that tried to restrain her, and seized her daughter in a fierce embrace. For a moment, nothing happened. The child stood passively in her mother's arms, neither responding nor resisting. Then, slowly, the girl raised her head and looked at her mother with eyes that were as empty as winter sky. "Mama," she said, and her voice was her own voice, but also something else, something that echoed and multiplied until it seemed to come from a great depth. "Mama, I am home." The mother began to weep, clutching her daughter tighter, rocking back and forth as if the motion could somehow restore what had been lost. The other parents, seeing this, broke forward as well, unable to resist the pull of their children despite the wrongness that hung over them like smoke. They gathered their sons and daughters into their arms, touching their faces, their hair, their small hands, searching for some sign of the children they had known. But I watched, standing apart from the reunions, and I saw what the parents were too desperate to see. The children accepted the embraces but did not return them. They spoke when spoken to but offered nothing of their own. They smiled when prompted, but the smiles did not reach their eyes. And beneath it all, beneath the familiar faces and voices, there was an emptiness, a void, where the essential spark of childhood should have been. Don Rodrigo stood beside me, his jaw clenched tight. "It has happened before," he said quietly. "When I was a boy, 4 children went to the arroyo and came back like this. My sister was one of them. What happened to them?" He was silent for a long moment, watching as the families led their children back toward the village. "They lived," he said finally. "They grew up, married, had children of their own, but they were never quite right, never quite whole. And their children, when they came, were born without shadows too. It passes down through the blood, Father. Whatever they brought back with them from that place, it becomes part of the family line." I felt sick, a deep revulsion that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. "We must help them. There must be something we can do." Don Rodrigo shook his head. Father Ignacio tried. He prayed over them, blessed them, performed every rite the church allows. Nothing worked. In the end, he went to the arroyo himself, trying to understand what had taken them. And you see how well that turned out. The village settled into a strange routine over the following days. The children moved through their lives like sleepwalkers, eating when fed, speaking when spoken to, performing simple tasks when directed, but they showed no initiative of their own, no spontaneous joy or anger or fear. They were present, but not alive, functioning, but not feeling. The parents tried desperately to reach them, to spark some recognition of the bonds they had once shared, but the children responded to all of them with the same mild, distant courtesy one might offer a stranger. I visited each family, offering what spiritual comfort I could, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. How could I speak of God's mercy and love when confronted with such clear evidence that there were powers beyond his reach, or at least beyond his willingness to intervene? The parents asked me to pray over their children, to bless them, to drive out whatever had taken hold of them. I did so, performing the rites with all the faith I could muster, but nothing changed. The children remained as they were, hollow vessels wearing familiar faces. On the third night after their return, I was woken by singing. It was the sound Father Ignacio had written about in his journal. Young voices rising in harmony, wordless and beautiful and utterly wrong. I rose and went to the window, looking out toward the arroyo. In the moonlight, I could see small figures gathered at the edge of the village. 5 children standing in a circle, their faces tilted up toward the stars. They were singing, their voices weaving together in patterns that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest, something that wanted to answer, to join them. I grabbed my rosary and ran from the house, my bare feet slapping against the cold ground. As I approached the children, they fell silent, turning to look at me with their empty eyes. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I intended. "You should be in your beds." The girl with the dark braids stepped forward. Her name was Anna, and she had been the youngest of the group that disappeared. "We are singing the old song, Father, the song that calls to the ones below. They taught it to us in the dark place." "What dark place? Where did you go when you left the village?" "Down," she said simply. "Down into the earth where the light cannot reach, where the shadow people live." My skin crawled. "There are no shadow people, child. There is only God and his creation." Anna tilted her head, studying me with those terrible empty eyes. "You are wrong, Father. The shadow people were here first, before your God, before the sun and moon. They lived in the world when it was all darkness, and they do not like the light. It hurts them. It makes them angry. But in the dark places they are still strong, and they hunger. Hunger for what? For shadows," she said. "For the dark shapes that light makes when it touches living things. Our shadows are pieces of us that belong to the darkness. The shadow people want them back." I made the sign of the cross, my hand shaking. "In the name of Christ, I command you to—" "Christ has no power here," Anna interrupted, her child's voice suddenly ancient and cold. "We tried calling to him when we were in the dark. We screamed his name until our throats bled, but he did not come. The shadow people came instead. They took what was ours and gave us back to you, but not all of us." "Never all of us." The other children had begun to sing again, their voices rising in that wordless, haunting melody. I stumbled back, clutching my rosary so tightly that the beads cut into my palm. Before I could speak again, hands grabbed my arms, pulling me away. It was Don Rodrigo and 2 other men, their faces grim. "Come, Father," Don Rodrigo said. "You cannot reason with them, not when they are like this." They dragged me back toward the church while the children continued their singing, the sound following us through the dark streets like a physical presence. Once inside the church, Don Rodrigo barred the door and lit several candles, placing them around the altar. The other men joined him, and together they began arranging salt in lines across the floor, marking out symbols I did not recognize. "What are you doing?" I asked. "This is witchcraft. This is survival," Don Rodrigo replied. "The church's rituals do not touch what lives in the arroyo. But the old ways, the ways our ancestors learned from the Pueblo people, these have power here. Salt and sage and symbols older than your Bible. They create barriers that the shadow people cannot cross." I wanted to object, to assert the supremacy of Christian doctrine, but the memory of Anna's empty eyes and cold voice stopped me. "Tell me everything," I said. "Everything you know about this place and what lives here." Don Rodrigo nodded slowly and began to speak, telling me a history that the church had never recorded. The Pueblo people who lived in this valley before the Spanish came had known about the shadow people, had left offerings to appease them, and strict taboos to avoid their attention. The most important rule was simple: never go to the arroyo after dark, especially during the new moon when the darkness was deepest. Never disturb the ruins of the old kiva that lay buried in the riverbed. And above all, never let children go there alone, because children's shadows were the most precious to the things that lived below. But the Spanish had come with their God and their certainty, declaring the old beliefs to be superstition and devil worship. They built their mission church directly over one of the offering sites, disrupting the careful balance the Pueblo people had maintained. For a while, nothing happened. Years passed, then decades, then a century. The shadow people retreated deeper into the earth, withdrawing from the light. The colonists thought they had won, thought their faith had driven out the old powers. Then, 50 years ago, during a drought when the river ran completely dry, children began playing in the arroyo. They discovered the ruins of the kiva, dug into the buried chambers, brought out artifacts that should have remained hidden. And on the night of the new moon, 5 children went to sleep in their beds and woke up somewhere else, somewhere deep beneath the ground where the shadow people waited. The children were gone for 3 days. When they returned, they walked back into the village just as Anna and the others had done, moving in single file, their eyes blank, their shadows gone. And with them, they brought a change, a corruption that spread slowly through the settlement like poison seeping into water. The first sign was the dreams, Don Rodrigo said. Everyone in the village began having the same dream. We would find ourselves in a vast chamber carved from black stone, lit by a light that came from no source. And there would be figures moving in that space, tall and thin, with too many joints in their limbs. They would reach for us with hands that were all fingers, touching us, measuring us, as if deciding whether we were worth keeping. The men who had come with Don Rodrigo nodded, their faces pale in the candlelight. One of them, a lean man named Tomas, spoke up. My daughter was one of the children who returned without her shadow. She lived to be 43 years old, but she was never right, Father, never truly alive. She married and bore 3 children, and all 3 were born the same way, without shadows from the very first moment they breathed air, and they too were empty, hollow. The corruption passes down through blood and cannot be purged. I felt a great weight settling over me, the burden of knowledge I wished I could unknow. Why didn't you leave? Why stay in a place cursed like this? Don Rodrigo's laugh was bitter. You think we didn't try? Families have left over the years trying to escape, but the children who lack shadows, they cannot survive in places with too much light. The bright sun of the open plains burns them from the inside out. They can only live here, in this valley where the mountains create long shadows and the light falls slant. This is their prison and ours. Then what can be done? Is there no hope at all? Father Ignacio thought he could find an answer. He spent months researching, writing letters to scholars in Mexico City and Spain, studying everything he could find about the old religions and the creatures they feared. He became convinced that the shadow people were not demons in the Christian sense, but something older, something from before the world was divided into good and evil. He thought that if he could communicate with them, negotiate with them, he might be able to make a trade. What kind of trade? Don Rodrigo's face was grim. He would offer his own shadow in exchange for the children's, one complete soul given willingly in place of 5 partial ones. He believed his sacrifice would be acceptable to them, that they might honor such a bargain. And did he make this trade? We don't know. He left in the middle of the night, walking toward the arroyo with a lantern and his Bible. We found the lantern the next morning, still burning at the edge of the Kiva ruins. The Bible was there too, its pages torn out and scattered. But Father Ignacio himself was gone. No body, no shadow, no sign of what became of him. And the children remained unchanged. I felt a great sadness settling over me like a shroud. Father Ignacio had been braver than I, willing to sacrifice everything in an attempt to save souls he barely knew. And he had failed, or been taken, or perhaps succeeded in some way we could not perceive. I must see the place, I said. The arroyo, the Kiva ruins. I must understand what we are facing. The men exchanged glances. It is dangerous, Father, Tomas warned. Especially now with the new moon approaching. The shadow people are most active when the darkness is deepest. I will go during the day, I said, in full sunlight. If these creatures fear the light as you say, they cannot harm me while the sun shines. Don Rodrigo sighed but did not argue. Very well, but take precautions. Wear salt in your pockets. Carry sage. And whatever you do, do not descend into the Kiva itself. Look from above. Observe what you must, but do not go down into the darkness. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun rising over the mountains in a blaze of gold and red. I prepared carefully, filling my pockets with salt as Don Rodrigo had instructed, tucking bundles of dried sage into my belt. I carried my rosary in one hand and a small flask of holy water in the other. Don Rodrigo had offered to accompany me, but I refused. If I was to understand the truth of this place, I needed to face it alone. The walk to the arroyo took less than an hour. The day was warm despite the late season, and I could hear birds singing in the scrub brush, a normal sound that somehow made the landscape seem even more alien. The arroyo appeared as a dark slash across the earth, a wound that had never properly healed. I stood at its edge, looking down into the channel, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Kiva ruins were easy to spot, a circular depression near the center of the arroyo floor, surrounded by scattered stones that might once have been a wall. Parts of the structure had been excavated, probably by the children who had first disturbed it, and I could see into the upper chamber, a space about 10 feet across lined with ancient timbers. A ladder led down into deeper darkness, its rungs carved from a single piece of wood that had somehow resisted decay despite centuries of exposure. I descended into the arroyo carefully, my feet slipping on the smooth stones. The temperature dropped as I went lower, and the sunlight seemed to dim, even though the sky remained clear. By the time I reached the Kiva entrance, I was shivering, my breath misting in front of my face. I approached the opening slowly, aware of Don Rodrigo's warning not to enter, but drawn by a terrible need to see what lay below. The ladder descended into perfect darkness, a blackness so complete that it seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than merely exist in its absence. I held out my hand, watching as the bright morning sun fell across my skin, and then moved my hand closer to the Kiva entrance. As my hand crossed into the shadow of the opening, I felt something pull at it, a gentle but insistent tug, as if invisible hands were trying to draw me down into that darkness. I jerked back, my heart racing. But the pull remained, a constant pressure that grew stronger the longer I stood near the entrance. It was not physical force, but something deeper, something that called to a part of me I had not known existed, a part that had always lived in shadow, that longed to return to darkness, to be absorbed back into the primal night from which all things came. And then I heard the voices. They rose from the depths of the Kiva like smoke, whispering in languages I did not know, speaking in tones that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my bones. I heard my name, Miguel, spoken by a voice that sounded like my mother's but twisted, made hollow and cold. I heard prayers I had memorized as a child, the words pronounced backward, their meaning inverted. I heard the names of saints and angels transformed into curses, blessings made into condemnations. I stumbled away from the Kiva, my legs weak, my mind reeling. But as I turned to flee, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, carved into the stone wall of the arroyo, were hundreds of handprints, each one small, the size of a child's palm. They had been painted in something dark, something that had dried to a reddish-black color over the years, and beneath each handprint was a name, scratched into the stone in crude letters. I recognized some of the names. They belonged to children from the village, children who had died decades or even centuries ago. But they were not the names of the children who had returned without their shadows. These were different children, ones I had never heard mentioned. And as I studied the wall more closely, I realized that for every 5 handprints clustered together, there was a gap, a space where a 6th handprint should have been, but was absent. The pattern repeated across the entire wall. 5 prints, then a gap. 5 prints, then a gap. Always 5 children taken, always one space left empty. And with a sick, dawning horror, I understood what I was seeing. The shadow people did not want all the children. They took 5, but expected 6. The 6th was meant to go willingly, to descend into the Kiva of their own choice, offering themselves in exchange for the others' return. That was the trade they had always demanded, the price that had gone unpaid for generations. 5 children stolen, 1 child given freely. But no one had given that 6th child, and so the 5 who were taken came back broken, empty, their shadows claimed as partial payment for a debt that remained forever unsettled. Father Ignacio had understood this. He had seen the pattern, realized the truth, and decided to offer himself as the missing 6th sacrifice. But he was not a child, and apparently, that mattered. The shadow people had taken him but given nothing in return. His sacrifice had been meaningless, or perhaps worse than meaningless, an insult that had only angered them further. I left the arroyo at a run, my cassock tangling around my legs, salt spilling from my pockets. By the time I reached the village, I was gasping for breath, my face streaked with sweat and tears. I found Don Rodrigo in the plaza and told him everything I had seen, everything I had understood. He listened with the expression of a man hearing his own death sentence confirmed. "So there is no escape," he said quietly. "The debt will never be paid unless we give them what they want. A child, one of our own children, sent willingly into the darkness. I cannot countenance such a thing," I said. "I cannot ask a family to sacrifice their child to these creatures. Then the 5 who returned will remain as they are, and when they have children, those children will be born without shadows, and the curse will spread through generations until every child in this village is hollow and empty. Is that preferable, Father? Is that the mercy your God offers?" I had no answer. For the first time in my life, my faith offered me no guidance, no comfort, no clarity. I was standing at the edge of an abyss that theology had no words to describe, facing choices that no moral framework could encompass. Save 5 children by sacrificing one, or save one child and condemn 5 to a half-life of emptiness that would echo down through their bloodlines forever. That night, I knelt in the church and prayed with a desperation I had never before experienced. I begged God for guidance, for a sign, for anything that might show me a path through this darkness. But the church remained silent, the candles burned without warmth, and I heard nothing but my own voice echoing off the thick adobe walls. As midnight approached, I heard singing again. The children were calling, their voices weaving together in that terrible, beautiful melody. I went to the window and saw them gathered in the plaza, all 5 of them, their faces tilted up toward the starless sky. And surrounding them were the villagers, dozens of families, standing in a silent circle, watching. I ran outside, pushing through the crowd. "What is this? What are you doing?" Don Rodrigo stood at the edge of the circle, his face carved from stone. "We have made a decision, Father. The village has voted and we are agreed. The debt must be paid. You cannot mean to, not one of our children," he said quickly. "We would not ask that of any family. But there are orphans, Father. Children who have no parents, no one to mourn them. We care for 3 such children here in San Cristóbal. We have decided that one of them will be chosen." I felt bile rise in my throat. "That is murder. It is an abomination." "It is survival," Don Rodrigo said, his voice hard. "These 5 children who returned empty will never truly live. They will marry and bear children who are also empty, spreading the curse through our community like a disease. In 3 generations, there will be no whole children left in San Cristóbal. We will become a village of shells, of hollow things wearing human faces. The orphans have no families to carry on their names, no bloodlines to protect. Their sacrifice will save dozens, perhaps hundreds of future children from this fate." "No," I said. "I cannot allow this. I am the priest of this village, and I forbid it in the name of God and the church." The crowd stirred, and I saw anger in their faces, desperation, and something else. Fear, yes, but also a terrible resolve. These were people who had lived with this curse for generations, who had watched it hollow out their children and grandchildren. They had reached the end of their endurance and were willing to do whatever it took to protect those who could still be saved. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was young, perhaps 30, with the worn hands of someone who had labored all her life. "I was one of the children who returned without a shadow," she said quietly. "I know what they took from me, what I lost in that darkness. I have a daughter now, and she was born without a shadow like me, empty like me. I would do anything, Father, anything to spare other children from this fate. If taking one child's life can save many, then that is the choice we must make." Others began to speak, adding their voices to hers, telling stories of children who had never laughed spontaneously, who had never cried real tears, who had never felt genuine joy or sorrow or love. They spoke of marriages that were like play acting, of grandchildren who called them by name but felt nothing, of a spreading numbness that was consuming their community one generation at a time. And standing in the center of it all, the 5 returned children sang their wordless song, oblivious to the debate raging around them, calling to something in the darkness that waited patiently for its due. I left them there and walked back to the church, my mind in turmoil. Inside, I lit every candle I could find, filling the space with flickering light, trying to drive back the darkness that seemed to press against the walls. I opened my Bible, searching for some precedent, some story that might guide me. I found Abraham and Isaac, the father willing to sacrifice his son at God's command. I found the stories of martyrs who gave their lives for the faith. But I found nothing that spoke to this situation. Nothing that addressed the question of trading one innocent life for many. As dawn approached, I heard a sound at the church door. It was light, tentative, the kind of knock a child might make. I opened the door to find a small boy standing there, perhaps 8 years old, with tangled hair and bare feet. I recognized him as one of the orphans Don Rodrigo had mentioned. His name was Mateo, and he had been found wandering in the desert 2 years ago, the sole survivor of a wagon train attack. "They say I am to be sent to the dark place," Mateo said, his voice small but steady. "Is it true, Father?" I knelt down so I could look him in the eye. "What do you know about the dark place?" "I know that the shadow children came from there. I know that something lives there that takes things from people. The villagers say that if one person goes down willingly, the others might be made whole again. They say I should be the one because I have no family to miss me." Tears burned in my eyes. "You are a child of God, Mateo. You have as much right to life as anyone in this village. But if me going down there helps the others, shouldn't I go? Isn't that what God would want? For one person to save many?" I had no answer. This child, barely old enough to understand death, was asking me questions that theologians had debated for centuries, and he deserved better than silence. "Come inside," I said, leading him into the church. We sat together in the front pew, and I tried to explain the complexity of the situation, the impossibility of the choice. But even as I spoke, I knew that words would not be enough. This was not a philosophical problem to be solved through argument. It was a raw, terrible reality that demanded action. Mateo listened patiently, his small face serious. When I finished, he said, "I am afraid, Father, but I have been afraid before. When the men came and killed my parents, I was afraid. When I walked through the desert alone, I was afraid. I am still alive, because I learned to do things even when I am afraid." "This is different," I said. "This is asking you to walk into certain death or worse than death, to be taken by things that should not exist, for a purpose we barely understand. But if I don't go, the 5 children will stay empty, and their children will be empty, and it will go on, right?" I nodded, unable to speak. Mateo was quiet for a long time, his small hands folded in his lap. Finally, he said, "Then I will go, but only if you come with me, Father. Only if you stay with me until the end." And there it was, a child offering me absolution for the crime I was about to commit, asking only that I have the courage to witness what my inaction had made necessary. I wanted to refuse, to grab Mateo and run from this cursed village, to find some way to save him without sacrificing the others. But I knew there was nowhere to run, no escape from the choice that had been placed before us. "I will stay with you," I promised. "I will not let you face the darkness alone." We told Don Rodrigo of Mateo's decision as the sun rose over the mountains. The alcalde's face showed relief and shame in equal measure. He tried to thank Mateo, but the boy simply shook his head. "Do not thank me," he said. "Just remember what you made me do. Remember it for all the days you have left." The villagers gathered as we prepared for the journey to the arroyo. The families of the 5 shadowless children came forward, bringing gifts for Mateo: food, a warm blanket, a small wooden cross carved by someone's grandfather. They touched his head as they passed, blessing him in whispers, asking forgiveness from a child who should never have been asked to forgive. We walked to the arroyo at noon, when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest. Mateo held my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for such a small child. The 5 returned children walked with us, moving in their synchronized way, still singing their wordless song. Behind us came the villagers, a long line of witnesses to a sacrifice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At the edge of the kiva, we stopped. The darkness below seemed even deeper in the bright daylight, a pool of absolute blackness that my eyes could not penetrate. The ladder descended into that void, its ancient wood still solid, still waiting to be used for its original purpose. Mateo looked up at me. "Will it hurt?" I could not lie to him. "I don't know." He nodded, accepting this. Then he surprised me by asking, Will you pray for me, Father? Not now, but after, when I am gone. Will you remember to pray for my soul? Every day, I promised, for the rest of my life. Mateo smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face. Thank you. He turned to the ladder and placed his small hands on the rungs, but before he could descend, he looked back one more time. Father, if the 5 children become whole again, tell them I said it was worth it. Tell them to live good lives. Tell them to have children who are born with shadows and to teach those children to be brave. Then he climbed down into the darkness. I watched him descend, his small form growing dimmer with each rung until he disappeared completely into the blackness below. For a moment there was silence, absolute and profound. Then I heard Mateo's voice rising from the depths, not screaming but singing, his child's voice joining with the melody the shadowless children had been weaving. The song swelled and grew, harmonizing in ways that human voices should not be able to achieve, creating resonances that made my teeth ache and my bones vibrate. The 5 shadowless children stopped moving. They stood perfectly still, their faces tilted upward, their mouths open. And then, as I watched in horror and wonder, darkness began to seep from the kiva entrance like smoke, flowing up the ladder and across the ground. But this darkness was different from mere shadow. It was alive, sentient, moving with purpose and intelligence. The darkness reached the 5 children and wrapped around their feet like water. It climbed their legs, their torsos, their necks, and as it touched them, they began to change. Color returned to their faces. Their eyes, which had been empty and flat, suddenly sparked with something real, something present. One of them, the girl Anna, drew in a sharp breath and looked around as if seeing the world for the first time. "Mama," she said, and her voice was her own, fully human, filled with confusion and fear and relief. "Mama, where am I? What happened?" Her mother rushed forward, gathering her daughter into her arms, sobbing with a mixture of joy and grief. The other children were similarly confused, disoriented, remembering nothing of their time in the darkness or their days of emptiness. They were whole again, their shadows restored, their souls returned to them. But the price had been paid in full. From deep within the kiva, I heard a sound that was almost like satisfaction, a deep resonance that vibrated through the earth itself. Then Mateo's singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. I fell to my knees at the kiva entrance, looking down into the darkness. "Mateo!" I called. "Mateo, answer me!" There was no response. The darkness below was complete and impenetrable. I grabbed the ladder, intending to descend, to bring him back, but hands pulled me away. Don Rodrigo and the other men held me as I struggled, as I raged against them and God and the terrible choice that had been made. "He is gone, Father," Don Rodrigo said quietly. "The trade is complete. If you go down there now, it will not bring him back. It will only add your death to his." I sagged in their grip, all strength leaving my body. They helped me back to the surface, back to the village. But I remember nothing of that journey. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in the darkness with a child who had shown more courage than any adult I had ever known. The days that followed were a blur of grief and numbness. The 5 restored children recovered quickly, their memories of their time without shadows fading like bad dreams. Their families celebrated, thanking God and the saints, and carefully not mentioning the price that had been paid for this miracle. But I could not forget. Every time I looked at those children, healthy and whole and full of life, I saw Mateo's small form descending into darkness. I conducted a funeral mass for Mateo, even though there was no body to bury. The entire village attended, and they wept as I spoke of sacrifice and love and the terrible burdens that innocent souls are sometimes asked to bear. But their tears felt hollow to me, performative, an attempt to absolve themselves of guilt they would carry forever. After the Mass, Don Rodrigo approached me. "Will you stay, Father? Will you continue to minister to San Cristóbal?" I looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his aged face the weight of all the impossible choices this village had forced upon its people. "No," I said finally. "I cannot remain here. Every stone, every shadow reminds me of what we have done. I will request a transfer and recommend that the church abandon this mission. You will tell them why." What would I tell them? That we sacrificed a child to appease ancient creatures that live beneath the earth? That we traded one life for 5 and called it mercy? No one would believe me. They would think me mad. Don Rodrigo nodded slowly. Perhaps that is for the best. Some truths are too heavy to share. I left San Cristóbal on a cold morning in late December. As I walked away from the village, I looked back one last time. The children were playing in the plaza, all of them whole and shadowless and innocent, unaware of the price that had been paid for their wholeness. And standing at the edge of the village, watching me leave, was a figure I almost did not recognize. It was a child, small and thin, with tangled hair and bare feet. For a moment, I thought it was Mateo, impossibly returned. But as the figure moved, I saw that it cast no shadow, and I understood. It was not Mateo, but something wearing a shape similar to his, a reminder of what had been lost, a ghost or echo or final message from the darkness below. The figure raised one hand in farewell, and then it turned and walked toward the arroyo, its small form growing dimmer with each step until it disappeared entirely. I have been away from San Cristóbal for 20 years now. I serve in a different parish, in a different territory, ministering to souls who know nothing of shadow people or impossible choices. I have tried to forget, to bury the memories under layers of prayer and routine and deliberate ignorance. But at night, when the darkness is deepest and the moon is new, I still hear singing, young voices weaving together in wordless harmony, calling to something that waits patiently in the spaces between light and dark. And sometimes, when the sun is setting and the shadows grow long, I look down at my feet and wonder if my own shadow is truly mine, or if it belongs to something else, something that is only lending it to me until the day when my own debt comes due. I have written this account not as confession but as warning. There are places in this world where the old powers still hold sway, where the borders between light and darkness are thinner than we imagine. The Church teaches that Christ has conquered death and darkness, that his light reaches into all corners of creation. But I have stood at the edge of places his light does not reach, where older laws apply and older debts must be paid. The children of San Cristóbal are whole now, living normal lives, having children of their own who are born with shadows and souls intact. The curse has been lifted, the debt satisfied. But I cannot help wondering if it was worth the price. Was Mateo's sacrifice noble or tragic? Was our choice necessary or monstrous? I have spent 2 decades searching for answers in prayer and scripture, and I have found none. What I have found instead is a terrible understanding that there are situations where every choice is wrong, where virtue and vice blur together until they become indistinguishable. That sometimes the only difference between a saint and a murderer is the story we tell ourselves about the necessity of our actions. Mateo died so that others might live. That is the story the village tells, the story they have carved into a memorial stone in the plaza, where his name stands alongside the names of other children who were lost to the darkness over the centuries. They call him a martyr, a saint, a blessed soul who now sits at the right hand of God. But I know the truth. Mateo was not a martyr. He was a child who was given an impossible choice by adults who should have protected him. He was brave and selfless and loving in ways that shame us all. But he should never have been asked to make that choice. He should never have walked down into that darkness alone. And I, who promised to stay with him until the end, who swore I would not let him face the darkness alone, I stood at the top of the ladder and watched him descend. I did not follow. I did not shield him with my body or offer myself in his place. I let a child walk into hell while I remained in the light, and I have been paying for that cowardice every day since. The people of San Cristóbal think their curse is lifted, their debt paid, their children safe. But I know better. The shadow people are patient. They have waited for centuries, and they can wait centuries more. They gave back what they took because the price was met, but they did not promise that the price would never be asked again. Somewhere in the darkness beneath the earth, in chambers carved from stone before the first human drew breath, they are waiting, measuring, remembering. And when the time is right, when another generation forgets the old warnings and disturbs the old places, they will take what they are owed. 5 children stolen, 1 child given freely. That is the law, older than the church, older than civilization, older than light itself. And laws like that do not die. They only sleep, waiting for the day when they will be needed again. I am old now, my hair white, my hands shaking with palsy. I will die soon, I think, and I wonder what I will face on the other side. Will I be judged by the God I served, the God whose light I believed could drive out all darkness? Or will I find myself in those black chambers beneath the earth, standing before the shadow people, finally paying the debt I incurred when I let a child die in my place? I do not know. But when the darkness comes for me, as it surely will, I hope I have the courage that Mateo showed. I hope I can face it without flinching, without regret, knowing that some debts must be paid, some sacrifices must be made, and that redemption, if it exists at all, lies not in avoiding the darkness but in choosing how we meet it. The children of San Cristóbal still sing sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark. I am told their voices carry across the desert, beautiful and haunting and full of joy. They sing songs they learned from their parents, songs of faith and hope and light. But underneath those familiar melodies, if you listen carefully, you can hear something else. An older rhythm, a darker harmony, the echo of a wordless song that rises from the earth itself. The children do not know what they are singing. They do not remember the darkness or the price that was paid. They live their lives in the light, blessed and whole, their shadows falling where shadows should fall. But the darkness remembers. It always remembers. And it is always waiting. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some debts can never truly be paid. And some children should never have to make the choices that adults lack the courage to face. This is the truth that San Cristóbal de las Sombras taught me. This is the burden I carry, the knowledge that haunts my dreams and shadows my prayers. And when I close my eyes for the last time, when I take my final breath and slip from light into darkness, I will carry it with me still. Mateo's last words echo in my memory every day. Tell them to be brave. I have told them. I have written it down, preserved it, passed it on. But bravery alone is not enough. Bravery without wisdom becomes recklessness. Sacrifice without purpose becomes waste. And light without shadow is not salvation, but blindness. The children who returned without their shadows taught us that. And Mateo, who walked into darkness so they could be whole, taught us the price of that lesson. I pray that his sacrifice was enough. I pray that the debt is truly paid, that future generations will be spared the choice we faced. But prayer is not certainty, and hope is not truth. The darkness is patient, the darkness is deep, and the darkness is always, always hungry. May God forgive us for what we have done. May he protect the children who sing in the night unaware of the price that was paid for their innocence. And may he grant rest to the soul of Mateo, the orphan boy who showed us what courage looks like when stripped of all hope, all comfort, all escape. I do not know if there is redemption for what we did in San Cristóbal, but I know that Mateo deserved better than the choice we gave him, better than the death we allowed him to walk into, better than the silence that followed his descent into darkness. He deserved to live, to grow, to laugh and love, and make his own choices in his own time. And we took that from him, all of us, with our fear and our desperation and our terrible certainty that some lives matter less than others. That is the real curse of San Cristóbal de las Sombras. Not the shadow people or their hunger or their ancient debts. The real curse is what we become when we are forced to choose who lives and who dies, who is whole and who is empty, who stays in the light and who descends into darkness. The real curse is knowing that we made the choice and must live with it forever. The children sing, the shadows fall, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, in chambers we will never see, Mateo's voice joins the chorus of all those who were given to the darkness, all those who paid debts they did not owe, all those who walked into the night so that others could remain in the day. Their song has no words, but if you listen carefully, very carefully, you can hear what it says. It says, "Remember us, honor us, do not forget the price we paid for your light." And above all, it says, "Be brave, be kind, be better than those who came before, because some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. But once you cross them, there is no going back. There is only forward, into the darkness or the light, carrying the weight of all the choices you made and all the souls you sacrificed along the way." This is what I learned in San Cristóbal de las Sombras. This is what I carry with me into whatever comes next. And this is what I leave behind for those who come after, a warning carved in words instead of stone, a memorial to a child who deserved better, and a reminder that the darkness, once fed, is never truly satisfied. It only waits for the next offering, the next choice, the next child who must decide between their own life and the lives of others. And when that day comes, as it surely will, I pray that whoever faces that choice has more courage, more wisdom, and more mercy than we did. I pray they find a better way, but I do not believe they will, because some debts can only be paid in blood and shadow, and the small brave voices of children who should never have been asked to sing.